Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, February 23rd. It's also a great pleasure to be joined in our virtual studio today by David Goodman, who's an award-winning journalist and the author of a dozen books, including 4 New York Times bestsellers that he co-authored with his sister, Amy Goodman, who is the host on the radio and TV news program Democracy Now! His work has appeared in Mother Jones, the New York Times, Outside, the Boston Globe, and other publications. He is the host of the Vermont Conversation, a VTDigger podcast featuring in-depth interviews about local and national topics. The Vermont Conversation is also an hour-long weekly radio program that can be heard on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. on WDEV Radio Vermont. Mr. Goodman, welcome to Press Pass.
It's great to be here with you.
I really appreciate you making the time for our conversation today. Thank you very much for that. I've been enjoying listening to your podcast for quite a while now. Always very interesting to listen to. Usually when I'm walking around the rec park, sort of trying to kind of get away from it all. But anyway, thanks again.
That's also when I listen to podcasts, when I go for a run and walk the dog. It's kind of perfect.
Yeah, it is. You know, you're kind of doing the best of both worlds here. Well, I wanted to start by just asking you to tell us a little bit about your earlier career in journalism before you became a podcaster, and kind of what drew you into the field way back in the beginning. Was it something you enjoyed just doing, writing, or was there a certain topic or something or another that you really were kind of interested in and wanted to kind of delve into further?
You know, for me, it goes way back to when I was a kid, and I had a little family newspaper called Dave's Press, in which I told family secrets and gossip and shared them with all my relatives who I charged for subscriptions. My grandparents would complain that I was charging more than Newsweek at the time. I think it was like $5 and Newsweek was $3. But I carried on with this. I still have a box of my old Dave's Press, which I would photocopy, early days of photocopying, and send around. And it would include everything from news of the day to TV reviews, movie reviews. But moving on, in high school, I attended high school, a big public high school on Long Island, a Bayshore Public High School. And it happened to have a really excellent school newspaper. And at the time, I'm not sure, we may have been known for, some sports teams and things, but this was this little pocket of excellence within the school. There was a wonderful English teacher named John Nash who just had a great ear for writing and reporting. He was not himself a journalist. The newspaper was called the Maroon Echo, and it won all these national awards at the Scholastic Journalism contests at Columbia. And it really was just this English teacher, Mr. Nash, who would work with us. And quite a few reporters came out of my high school as a result. Reporters for the Times, for Newsday, and other places. So I count myself as one of those. My sister so I was the editor of the paper when I was a senior, as was my sister, as was my older brother. We were all on the newspaper. It was kind of the thing to do if you were somebody who liked words. So I didn't do much of journalism in college, but as soon as I got out of college, I wanted to do the thing that I loved so much in high school, and I became, at that time, a freelance writer. And very soon after graduating college in the 80s, I had been very involved in the anti-apartheid movement at Harvard, and decided to go to Southern Africa and see for myself and begin reporting from there. And that was really kind of launched me. Not too many journalists from the U.S. were traveling to Africa. So I had a pretty wide open field and was writing for the Boston Globe and the Nation and other places about what I was seeing, mostly in apartheid South Africa, and ultimately wrote a book about it, South Africa's transformation from apartheid, called fault lines, journeys into the new South Africa, and have continued to write about and report on Africa in a variety of settings. But also, I was a passionate outdoors person, and am a passionate outdoors person, and worked for Outward Bound as an instructor at the time. And I got a call. So I was also doing writing about the outdoors, and got a call from the Appalachian Mountain Club asking me, would I be interested in writing a guide to skiing, something they had never had before. So that kind of launched this whole other part of my life. I'm now 30, over 30 years. I just did the fourth edition of the only backcountry skiing guidebook to the Northeast, which is my one of my passions that I share. My wife has long joined me on adventures when she can, but so I've continued to also write about backcountry skiing. So this kind of dual track of politics and international issues and the outdoors has been my niche, which it's kind of an anti-niche because I never really settled on just one thing. I have continued for my whole life to report on all of them.
Wow, that's fascinating. It makes me think that doing the backcountry skiing piece is probably a good therapy for the political part of it.
I think so. I mean, it makes sense to me. When people ask me, advice about freelancing, I talk about the free in freelance, which is the freedom to pursue kind of things you're interested in that may or may not, make sense to other people, but it makes sense to you. Because if you're not going to pursue those things, well, then you might as well get a staff job writing somewhere and have a more defined beat. But if you're going to freelance, which has its, I would say, its joys and pitfalls, then by all means, pursue your passions. So that's what I have continued to do.
How has the whole freelancing world changed over, let's say, the past 10, 15, 20 years, since the digital era has arrived in newspapers and magazines? Having worked in a couple of papers before winding up here, it was interesting to see, I'm not sure if interesting is the right word or not, but certainly at times scary to see how the whole digital evolution, evolved and impacted newspapers in particular over that time. It definitely it caused a lot of people. It was big transition for a lot of people and the industry as a whole. I guess I just wonder, where do you see that all going? Have we reached an end point at this point where newspapers have sort of figured out their relationship and marriage with the internet and the digital world and social media, and the big changes are sort of at least over for a while, or are we just at a stage with, I'm thinking with, ChatGPT, for instance, and artificial intelligence, so we're going to see another whole go around on how that's going to evolve?
Well, no, I don't think it's done changing. I think that the world of journalism is in a state of pretty radical transformation, and it's a very mixed bag, and how that is sugaring off. One result has been in really the hollowing out of local media. Every week in America, 2 more newspapers call it quits. 1/4 of local newspapers went under since 2005. And there are these growing news deserts across the country. And this is, it threatens our democracy. It threatens our ability to know what's going on in our community. We know that in places where local media goes away, fewer people run for office. Fewer people are held accountable. So, it's one of the things that has made me so passionate about working with a really innovative news outlet like VTDigger, which really seeks to tell stories and reach people in new ways and to fill the voids that are being created as local news entities pull back. And they're pulling back not because they want to, but because the old model of advertiser-supported legacy media has essentially had its legs cut out from under it by Facebook and other social media where most young people get their news now. So I'm not sure where this is landing. I have my hand in every side of it. I write for, big national outlets like the New York Times. I work with VTDigger. I do freelance reporting. And as an independent journalist, I think it's incumbent on us to, be working in all these media. But I really watch with great concern about what has happened to local media. And, for me, hosting the Vermont Conversation is partly one of the things I can do to help, to keep people informed about what is going on nationally and locally. And I think that, people are getting media in so many different formats. Some love podcasts, some love old-fashioned tactile newspapers that you can hold in your hand. Some are only accessing it on their phones, particularly younger people. So I just try to reach people wherever they are. And that's been my commitment. I think it's so important to hold the powerful to account. My sister often talks about going to where the silence is. Who's not at the table when we're having a conversation? To think about that, to think about bringing others into the room and putting a mic in front of them, because really one of the most powerful things we can do is to have people speak in their own voice. There is just nothing like that. And I think it does a lot to break through the kind of polarization where people are imagining that their opponent is something less than or other than their neighbor, their friend, or their people like them. So, and I know I'm kind of going on a long stretch here, but I will talk about a story on Vermont Conversation that I was very moved by in the last few months that, for me, kind of captures the power of media to tell a story. And that is that back in September, there was a whole controversy in Randolph Union High School in Randolph, Vermont, about a transgender student who was a member of the girls' volleyball team using the girls' locker room, and then suddenly became targeted by a few people and then national right-wing media, Fox News and others, accusing her of having done something wrong. There were huge community meetings in Randolph. 350 people came out. Very movingly, the captain of the girls' volleyball team defended this student and said she was where she should have been, in their locker room, on their team. But these, the power of the media, places like Fox News to rally people and enrage people, there was one voice through all this that was missing, and it was the student herself. And I reached out when all this was going on, VTDigger and others were doing some very good reporting. I reached out to the student's family to say, when she's up for talking, I would love to have her tell her story, tell her side of the story. And a few months went by, and in November, she reached out and said she would like to come on. And I encourage people to listen to this 14-year-old person who happens to be transgender, a Vermonter, tell her story of what it means to her to participate in school sports, what it means to be accepted for who she is, for the gender identity that she is, and how much support she's received, how she's dealing with the hate And it's just so powerful to hear. This is just a teenager talking about their life. And some of, part of our conversation is just talking about things that she enjoys doing, the music she listens to. Because for me, it was really important to humanize this person who had been turned into something other than just a teenage kid in Vermont trying to live her life.
I remember following that story. It must have been just crazy to be at the center of that whole controversy, because it did seem like that really had folks there just absolutely in a complete dither, for lack of a better term. And hopefully they've been able to move on a little bit anyway from that. Well, that's a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask you about next, which was your work as a podcaster. I guess it started about 10 years ago, would that be fair to say, when you began as a radio host on WDEV and then transitioned from there into podcasting, I guess, in 2020 was it? You began doing the podcasting series with Digger?
That's right. And, for people, particularly in Southern Vermont, who may not know WDEV, it's a very unusual institution. It is 90 years old. It is the oldest independent family-owned commercial radio station in America. It has been owned by the Squire family for just about all of its 90 years. Ken Squire is known in the motorsports world as just a legendary race car, NASCAR announcer. So Ken has owned this station, and this was at the time the Vermont Conversation began. I was asked at the beginning, the Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility wanted to sponsor a program, and I said, if it was editorially independent, and that was, I was willing to give it a try. I had not done radio before. So yes, it began on the radio, and it was also always a podcast. I would create a podcast for it. It was very easy to do, to post programs online. But in 2020, one of the, I call it the silver linings of the pandemic. And for me, it was that the program, VBSR, like so many groups, particularly groups that are involved with small business, really had to pull back from all but its core things. And so I approached Ann Galloway, who was the founder of Vermont Digger, and she immediately said yes. It was, and I've always felt Vermont Digger is the natural home for this. It was always a public affair news show. And the other silver lining during COVID was, instead of only interviewing people who were available Wednesday at 1 when the show was live, which was challenging, when you're trying to get public figures who are busy, we moved to recording everything on Zoom, just as we're doing here. And then I could get anybody anywhere. I felt like a dog off its leash. I was free, and I was running at top speed. And so, since we moved to Vermont Digger, and these last 3 years, I've had a lot of national guests, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who people may know from the January 6th hearings, journalists like David Sanger, who is one of the top national security reporters for the New York Times. So national figures like that. This week, we just re-released an interview with Yale historian Tim Snyder, who is the author of a best-selling book called On Tyranny. He's kind of an expert on authoritarianism, but also these Vermont stories. The trans student in Randolph, notable figures, Becca Balint, now Congresswoman, as well as I had Peter Welch and Patrick Leahy on just a few days after the January 6th attack to share in very kind of raw and visceral terms what it was like to physically be in the Capitol while they were under attack. And, I listen to that now, and, of course, these are public figures who are very accustomed to speaking And but it was a moment for both of them where it was just the feelings were very raw. It was very frightening on many levels, not just personally, their own personal safety, but also what was the future of democracy going to be? Was democracy going to survive this assault? And I think that question is still up for grabs.
Absolutely, no question about that. I guess you've sort of answered this to a degree, but I just wondered, how do you go about choosing the people you'd like to have on your podcast? I mean, obviously, it draws from current events, what's going on. You know, the January 6th situation you described, the transgender student from Randolph, be another example of that. But as you're following news and events going on, is there something you're looking for when you say, this would be an interesting person to have on my podcast, or maybe not, we'll wait a while? Is there anything that makes one person or another stand out?
It's a great question, and I am so fortunate to have that Vermont Digger gives me the total freedom to decide that. So I am a news junkie. I'm guessing you probably are too. And I'm just reading all the time, following things all the time, and stories. It's what strikes me as things that would engage an audience, things that people should know more about. A lot of times people come to me, and book authors may come to me, or a lot of times I'll hear something that I want to look into further. I was just reading a profile of a fascinating person in 7 days, a guy who I know. So I always, it kind of makes me go, why didn't I think of asking him? I know this guy. But, it can be anything. But most of all, when I began the Vermont Conversation a decade ago, Ken Squire, his advice to me, a lifelong broadcaster, was it has to be good radio. And by that, he meant it has to tell a story, it has to have a good character, and it has to be relevant and engaging for an audience. So I keep that in mind. Not everything makes sense for a podcast or radio program. It may be of interest to me, but perhaps not others. I do believe that everybody has a story. And if you ask the right questions and engage people respectfully and with curiosity, if you're doing all those things right, the story, you'll get that story. You'll get the interesting story that everyone has inside them. So that's what I look for. I don't have a set thing. It's mostly my sense of what's important, voices that need to be uplifted, and what will engage the audience. But and then there are just other larger journalistic ideals that I'm committed to, holding powerful people to account, being able to ask tough questions of people who may represent us in elected office, investigating things that need more exploration. But I do think it's incumbent on anyone who has any sort of a platform to lift up voices that may not have access ordinarily to an audience, to a larger platform. So whether it's that, teenage student in Randolph, or a few weeks ago I had on a former representative, Kaya Morris, an African-American representative from Bennington who was hounded out of the legislature by white supremacists. Her story matters. We can't let somebody like Kaya Morris be silenced by these, right-wing forces, people who seek to close down debate. I think whenever I see that happening, I want to go and open up the debate. I want to hear the ideas that people think are too dangerous to be in libraries or to be in legislatures, to make sure that those voices are never silenced.
And often those silent voices, they're a very hard audience, or at least my experience has been that sometimes those folks are very hard to draw into a conversation. They are sort of, I'm not sure if by design or by their own preference, prefer to remain on the sidelines. I mean, I remember trying to do a piece once on poverty in this area. Manchester is usually thought of as a very wealthy community, but there's lots of folks here who live right on the margins. And trying to find people to talk about what that was like was really challenging.
Well, I think patience is a virtue, and I think that sometimes, particularly when the hot glare of public attention is on somebody, it may be the right thing to just wait a week or two or three and circle back when the attention has gone away. That's often when people have a lot on their mind. They see what got attention, and now they have some thoughts about what really needs attention. So I'm quite happy of course, I'm happy to do breaking news, but I'm also quite happy to revisit a story a few months after it's been in the headlines to get people's thoughts and reflections. They often have some really deep insights at that time. So I think respect and patience really pay off for a journalist, and just not giving up on the story, particularly stories that matter, and particularly people who may be marginalized and are afraid. They have reasons to be afraid. They're not powerful, and they fear what might happen if they speak. But, I think if you can reassure them, if you can show them the respect that they deserve and reassure them that bad things won't happen if they speak, then those are often some of the most powerful testimonials.
Yeah, absolutely. We have about a minute left, and I just wanted to ask you what advice you might have for young journalists who are just starting off in this world that was so different from what it was even just 20 or so years ago. I mean, is it a case where, well, kid, it's a great job, great career, go into it with your eyes wide open and have a backup plan? Or if the dream doesn't work out? Or is there something else you would say to someone who's, let's say, in college or just starting their first job at a newspaper or a news organization somewhere? What would be your advice to them?
I think that follow your passion, because that's going to be your best writing and reporting, things that you really care about, maybe things you know something about. That matters. And, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I would say, as somebody who's been in a lot of different forms of media, it's been very helpful to me that as the ground shifts, I'm never all in one place. You just keep moving. And also, rejection is part of this game. And the most important thing is being able to pick yourself up after you get a rejection, because that is part of the game, and keep moving. Don't get stopped by that. Don't let anybody extinguish your dream. Keep going for it.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there for today. Unfortunately, boy, we could easily talk for another half an hour about this and more. But anyway, I want to thank you, David Goodman, podcaster with VTDigger. You can find his podcasts on VTDigger.org, and there's a lot of them there that are really quite fascinating to listen to. So thanks again, Mr. Goodman. Great to have you with us. Really appreciate you making the time for this conversation today. And to our audience out there, thank you for being with us. Thank you for sharing part of your day with us. And we'll see you again the next time. Take care.